is a deliverable on that project, and sometimes they're commissioned by research organisations to bring people up to date. But I think primarily they're coming from people who are interested in the topic, who want to survey it and communicate. People might write a substantial literature review as part of their PhD thesis, and then afterwards develop that into some review paper. And I suppose it's an interesting question about how does this compare in terms of sort of prestige and impact with primary research literature. And some people might say, well, there's less prestige to writing a review paper. You know, you're not contributing new ideas to the research by doing that. But nonetheless, they can be widely read, and you know, some of the most impactful papers, some of the most widely read papers in the field can often be these kinds of review papers. So this fits into a wider context of reviewing the literature, yeah? So, you know, as academics, researchers, students, particularly when we're on to the level of PhD or master's level research, you know, we have to write reviews of the literature. We might write other kinds of review contexts. We might say, you know, if we're writing a technological paper, we might review the current technology, the current commercial technology or open source technology that's available in a particular area. If we're doing something that's going to have impact in policy, we might write about a review of that policy context as well, and so on. So there might be specific things beyond the academic literature that we include in a review like this that relate to our work. And so we're doing this, you know, all the time as academics, where we might not be writing specific review papers, but you know, if we're writing an original research paper, we begin with a background and a literature review section. A master's dissertation or a PhD thesis will contain a substantial section that reviews the work, sets up the context for the literature done. So we might be setting up, you know, what I've described in the past as a thesis-shaped hole in the literature. You're saying, here's the existing research literature, it impacts upon our work in many different ways, but here's a gap in that literature, here's a hole in it that we're trying to fill with, say we're working on our PhD or something like that. We're trying to say, you know, what things led up to it, what open problems are there that make this gap, what you know, what techniques are being brought to bear on it, and all this gives us this research shaped, this research gap, this thesis shaped hole. So there's a similarity between preparing and writing a review paper and preparing and writing that review section for a paper or a dissertation or thesis that presents original research. Where are these sorts of things published? Well, if we look around the literature in our area, we might find journals that specialize in review papers. So I had a quick look around to find various topics, and there are things that are called things like survey of, or there's a journal here called Computing Surveys, quarterly review of research in, annual review of. So there are journals that specialize in publishing these kinds of review papers. There are also these book series, these little mini books that are, you know, published by publishers like Springer. They publish, you know, review type papers as well, but in the slightly more substantial ones in the form of these little short books and things like that. But also many regular journals in the paper, as well as publishing primary research papers, will also be open to publishing these kinds of review and survey papers. What is this contrast to the previous slide, We've talked about review journals in the sense of journals that publish reviews and surveys, but they're also sort of bibliographic journals like mathematics reviews. So here's an example of an entry from mathematics reviews. This is a different use of the word review here. This isn't a review in the sense of an overview of the whole literature. It's just a brief summary. So someone's read the paper and they've, it's not just a reprint of the author's abstract. It's someone else writing a summary of that paper, perhaps saying one or two other papers and problems that it relates to, perhaps doing some kind of analytical summary of it, saying something about the quality of the work and what it relates to. So there are journals like that publish those. That's not really within the scope of what I want to talk about today. And then if we look at a wider group of journals, we've got things, if we read a journal like Nature or Science or something like that, or more specialized ones like Communications, the ACM in computing, the Lancet in medicine, generalist articles that are not targeted at the general public as such, but they are general articles about current research areas in the area of the journal, or in some cases, in say science in general. And the target audience of those is the general reader in that discipline. Now these relate to what we might call review articles or survey articles, but they tend to be shorter, more selective summaries focusing on very recent research, so research that's just been published, contrasted with what I want to talk about primarily today, which is surveying, giving a wider, broader survey of research, often going back over many years of the research literature. So let's go on to think about what so reviews of all kinds, whether it's a review paper or the review section of a paper that's providing original research, is thematic in some way. Yeah, the idea is that if you're writing a paper like this, you're not just summarizing paper after paper after paper after paper without any structure. You're bringing together the literature in some kind of structure, some kind of group of themes. So I've chosen a review paper here, and this is the contents from the paper here. This is something about a machine learning task for clustering, and you don't need to know what that is to understand what I'm talking about. So what does it do? Well, it tells you what the task is and what the history of it was. It gives some definitions and some notation and so on. And then it talks in the core of the paper, it talks about the different techniques. So it doesn't just 200 different papers, this review paper, but it doesn't just mention 200 papers one after the other. It's put them into 12 different areas there, 12 different technique areas, and then 4 different application areas. So it's got some kind of structure to it. And indeed, later in the paper, they make an even more structured overview of this. So they have a nice diagram here. So they talk about clustering as a topic, and they say, well, it splits down broadly into hierarchical and partitional approaches, whatever they are. And then partitional approaches split down into these 4 approaches. This is a subtype of this. And this gives the reader an overview, a sense of what is going on in terms of it gives you can get an idea of what's going on in different areas of the subject. And this helps you when you're reading the paper. It helps you to understand the papers that they're surveying, the topics they're surveying, the ideas that they're discussing. But it also gives you a framework for your future reading. If you've read a paper like this, and if it's got a nice structure to it, particularly if it's articulated in the form of a diagram or a nice taxonomy like this, then when I'm reading a paper in the future on this topic, I can put it into that framework. It helps me to understand, it helps coming up with those themes is really important. A second aspect to this is that a good review paper takes a kind of critical, analytical, comparative view of the subject. It's not just descriptive of, again, it's not descriptive of each paper in turn, and it's not descriptive of each area. It makes comparisons. It helps you to understand, say, what techniques are better for what problem, or what what areas are still unresolved in the area. Perhaps it has a what we might call a personal view of the subject. I don't really mean a biased view, but there's some sense of, ideally, that you've thought about it, you're presenting your view as an authority in the subject, rather than just, but that shouldn't step over into, a biased view. You should, build that personal view based on evidence from the literature to compare ideas, to bring common ideas together. So here's, a number of excerpts from the paper, the same paper, about. I'm not, you don't need to know what the subject is to understand the point I'm making, but it says here, a majority of the approaches and algorithms proposed in the literature cannot handle such large data sets, blah, blah, blah. These techniques are restricted to relatively small data sets. Implementations optimize some criterion functions and are typically computationally expensive. So it's saying this set of approaches don't work for large data sets. It's saying what limitations are of some of the methods that are surveyed. The k-means algorithm is sensitive to initial seed selection and can only produce hyperspherical clusters. Hierarchical algorithms are more versatile. So it's comparing different classes of techniques there. It's saying this concept is particularly attractive for a particular task. However, it often adds additional measurements, and that removes that advantage. So they're not just describing what these algorithms in this case are, but they're being analytical about it. They're saying this is good for this problem, this is good for this task, this has these advantages, this has these advantages, but also these disadvantages of the literature, rather than just summarizing what's there. A third thing that a good review paper does is bring together diverse pieces of work in a systematic way. So one thing that happens as the literature in an area develops is we get differences in notations or terminology. So different people might be describing broadly the same concept, but using different vocabulary, different notation, different terminology. So one good thing you can do in a review paper is to bring those things together. So here's something from a review paper here. They had a section about definitions and notations, and they say what things are common here, yeah? So they use the word pattern, but they point out that elsewhere in the literature, the words feature vector, observation, and datum are also used for that term that they're going to call pattern. Again, the individual components of a pattern are called features or attributes. So they're saying there's different language used to unifying that vocabulary, yeah? You might bring a number of techniques together, you know, comparing techniques, perhaps using a particular kind of diagram to compare how they work so that you could compare them against each other. You might bring together experiments or measurements of some kind in some standard form. So here's another table from that paper, yeah? So they've got these various algorithms that are taken from different papers, and they've got some, they've measured some characteristic of them. Again, it doesn't matter what these things are. These things have time complexity and space complexity, but they measured them using a common format here, a common way of measuring those things. And they've said, you know, here's a table, you know, these things are mentioned in each paper, but we're going to bring them together in a single table so you can look across at them and immediately compare these 6 things from different parts of the research literature. So it brings together results into a single chart or table for the first time, and that's another valuable thing you can do to help people compare and contrast these different techniques or ideas or whatever it is in your paper. So let's think. In a sense, review papers are often attempt to be somewhat exhaustive. They attempt to bring together all the perspectives on a particular topic. That's not necessarily mention every last paper that's published, but it would seem wrong if a review paper missed out an important area of the subject. So how do you make sure that, you know, when you survey the literature, that it's thorough and covers all the areas? Well, obviously, we're fortunate to live in an era where there are you know, there's search, there's broad-based search engines that are designed specifically for academic research, but there are also subject-specific ones. So you know, this one in computer science, this one in philosophy, this one in medicine, for example. So a starting point, perhaps fairly obviously, is to searching for relevant keywords, so we can look for papers in that way. But papers don't exist on their own, of course, yeah? So papers exist in a network of citations. So, you know, papers cite past papers and are cited in their turn. So we can move our way around this network of papers. You know, this paper cites this paper, cites this paper, and then that paper cites that paper. And what's the, you know, how is that connection, how is that network realized? How do we navigate our way around that? Well, you know, obviously, if we look at a paper, we can look at the references in it, so we can go back and say, well, you know, we've got the references there. But the nice thing now is, of course, we can use a technique like Google Scholar to look forward. Yeah, so we used to be able to look back at papers that have been cited by a particular paper, but in the last, you know, 15 years or so, we've been fortunate now that we can look forward and we can say, this is a paper, and subsequent to its being published, it's been cited by another 141 papers, and we can get a list of those. So we can go back and forth in the research literature in that way, as a way of finding what we want to find. And the other feature that things like Google Scholar and so on have is things like author profiles. Look at what they've cited, what their most popular papers are, what their most recent papers are. So if we're finding papers by a particular author, quite commonly, it's good to look at their profile and say, can we see what else they've published? I find it useful to write a summary after I've read a paper. You know, as I say, a review paper isn't just a list of summaries of papers, but that's the starting point. Yeah, you know, and you're never in a better position to do that than immediately after you've read the paper. Yeah. So my advice is always to make notes immediately. You know, what these notes contain, what reference details, what the key ideas, algorithms, experiments, results are, you know, perhaps how it relates to your work, particularly if you're writing a review section of a paper that's got some original work in. And, you know, something I do is I give these things unique codes. So I make a little 3 or 4 letter abbreviation based on the author's initials. I name the PDF file with that abbreviation, and then I can write that abbreviation in my notes, and I can say, oh, this, you know, this uses the same ideas, but as this applies this algorithm to this, and so on. And then if I want to look at the actual paper, it's in a big folder with lots of papers, all of which are using those same codes. And then we can keep track of papers using, you know, different systems. You know, at our university, we have this thing called EndNote. I use LaTeX a lot, which has got BibTeX, and we use these to keep track of references. Yeah, so you keep a database of references, and then you can put in an in-text citation in that via that database key. So you can say, you know, here's that paper. You know, we can use that abbreviation, then that generates things like EndNote and Mendeley and RefWorks and BibTeX and all these things that enable us to unify our notes on the paper, the formal reference, and the copy of the paper we have help us to keep organized when we're writing a paper, whether it's a review paper or an original paper. So I've said, you know, one important thing if we're writing a review paper is to organize things thematically. Yeah. So when we start reading in some area, we're just reading papers. Yeah. We find papers, we read it, it will talk about some idea, some technique, some experiment, you know, whatever it's in a big space of ideas. Yeah, we'll read one paper, we'll read another one. We won't have an idea of how they connect together at first. You know, perhaps we might if we've already done. You know, we might have some idea because we've already have some knowledge of the subject, perhaps. But largely, things will start to seem quite isolated at first. So we can, but then as we read more, we start to think about themes. So we start to say, well, you know, here's a theme. Here's a term that's coming up a lot. Here's a technique that's coming up a lot. Here's a particular experimental method that a lot of people are using. Here's a particular statistical analysis technique that people are using a lot. So we can start to map these out. I quite like these kinds of concept maps, these mind maps where we're, you know, have an idea and we make connections, we draw lines between. They have the advantage you can move them around on the page. Yeah, I like to do this. I do like to do this on paper at this stage, either with post-it notes or with a big concept map like this. And that helps us to group things together. Yeah, we start to, you know, while we're reading, our thematic groupings, our hierarchies are going to take a while to emerge. So we're not going to write down the perfect structure initially. We'll need to change it and revise it. We might need to move our post-it notes around, group them together in different ways. We might cross out bits of our diagram or redraw it. But I think eventually we get to a point where we start to exhaust new ideas. We find new papers by search and by exploring this graph of citations and by looking at particular authors. And eventually we start to find that things typically fit into the existing structure we've got. And that's a good point where we think, actually, now I understand the research literature in this area, yeah? At first, all the papers seem isolated from each other. And then after a few weeks or months of reading around an area, you're starting to say, oh yes, that's another one of those. That fits into this part of my categorization. This one fits over here. This one fits over here. This one fits into my diagram over here. It's in this category. This one fits over here, and so on. And that's, you know, I think that helps us a lot. I think that's a, of the research literature, and that we can progress perhaps then to start writing our review paper or our review section or whatever it is. So I think one important thing is to think that papers can be relevant to a review in different ways, yeah? So if we think about a review paper, how is a paper relevant to the core topic of that review? Well, it might, we might most immediately think that those papers we're reviewing in our review paper, those papers that we're surveying, provide a specific technique or idea or critique or experiment or whatever that we want to include in our paper. So the majority of papers will probably fit into that category, yeah? We're surveying some area of the literature. This paper talks about this technique, this paper talks about this technique, and so on. So papers can be relevant in that way, but they can also be relevant in other ways, yeah? Some papers might provide resources. So a paper might outline a data set or a software library or something like that. It might provide some kind of resource rather than an idea or a technique. We might have a paper that illuminates misunderstandings or uncertainties in the topic. We might say this paper's we might directly say this particular paper is misunderstood, straight that we can critique that paper. It might describe an application area. So we might have some things that describe, what's going on in the topic, but then what it can be applied to. We saw that with that example that I used earlier. It had a section about the techniques that were used, and then a section that was applications of those techniques. So that can be another way in which papers are connected to the core topic. And it might open up new ideas in the area. So in the future work section of a paper at the end, we might connect things to the core topic because it opens up research gaps, opportunities for new research in the area. So papers can be relevant to our review paper in a number of ways. And similarly, if we're writing a review of our own, for our own original research, we can use papers in different ways to say, to contextualize our own work. So, the most obvious thing is our research new? If we're publishing a piece of original research now rather than writing a review paper, one role of the literature review section, the research background section, like in a paper or dissertation, is to outline the existing research and to say with references how your work varies. So here we've got an example. We've got an excerpt from a paper. Again, it doesn't matter what it's about, but there's lots of references here, yeah? So it's saying this has been successfully applied to this. This other technique's been successfully applied to these applications. And then there's a question at the end. So many tasks can be solved with essentially one model. A natural question arises. Here's an opportunity for some new research. Is this model the best we can hope for? So, there the authors of this paper have given a very question, which is answered in the original part of their paper. How else might papers be relevant? Well, if it's a paper that's just where you're describing your original research, you might say how your work builds on or contrasts with that. So, for example, you might say this works on a certain problem, but the main difference between that and our work is whatever. Here we've got another example here. This paper uses this technique for weather prediction. We find it encouraging because it hints that particular system might perform well in other contexts and so on. So, they're using other papers from the research literature to set a foundation to say, our work contrasts in this way, or our work's promising for these reasons. Similarly, your own work might draw on techniques and data sets from other papers. So you say, was outlined in these other papers and so on. And we might say, we might use a paper to compare our results against, if we're doing original research. We might, explain which other methods you're using as a comparison. And then, so here's an example from a paper. We compare our model with two baseline models. So they say briefly what they are, and there's a table that compares their work with these other existing works in the literature. So a paper can be relevant because you're comparing your work against it. So let's bring the topic back. The last few slides are about review sections in original research papers, but let's bring ourselves back to review papers again, yeah? So what specific types of review papers are there that beyond just the general review and survey paper of an area? Well, there are tutorial papers. There are papers that give an introductory tutorial to an area, yeah? But I think there's papers that describe themselves as tutorials, often describe techniques in more detail. So they might describe some research methodology, some statistical technique, some algorithms, analytical approaches, experimental protocols in some detail. A survey might say, there are these techniques, you can read about them in the original papers. A paper describing it itself as a tutorial might contain some description, say, of what those experimental methods are and how to go about doing them. There's no strict boundary between those two types of papers, yeah? I think there's a fuzzy boundary between things that are review papers and things that are tutorial papers. In some areas, people do what are called systematic reviews. So a typical review paper, survey paper, you'll write it based on your knowledge, your reading of the literature. You read around the literature, you find these connections, you find your own themes, and you write your overview of that area of the research literature. So, that's very useful. That's a very good thing. But a systematic or systemic review paper is much more formal than that. It will say in a typical research in this area fits into 6 categories. You know, there are 6 broad areas in the research literature. In a systematic review, you start from an earlier stage. So you say something like, I used Google Scholar with the following search terms to find the papers that I'm going to review in this. And you mention everything that you found, or you explain why you left things out. So it's a much more formal way of doing it. And some subjects like that kind of thing. Some subjects like you to articulate the methodology you used to find the papers that you're including in your review. And they're called systematic reviews. Another area, another kind of paper that's similar to a survey paper but has differences, are these things called meta-analyses. These are used a lot in the medical research literature. And these papers use statistical techniques to summarize the results from a number of papers. So rather than just saying informally, there are these studies of a treatment for a particular disease, and they'll try and take the tables of results, perhaps how successful different treatments were, put them into some common format, you know, do a statistical reanalysis of all those results. They're sort of imagining what happened if you did all those experiments at the same time. They're sometimes saying, this paper, we're going to exclude it because it didn't have enough participants, or we're going to downplay it in our statistical analysis because it didn't have many participants, or participants were chosen in a biased way or something like that. And the aim of this is not just to talk around the results from those papers, but to give a new kind of meta result. So it might compare, you know, 2 different approaches to treating some disease, and it will try and give a statistical summary based on a lot of papers in each of those 2 areas as to how successful each approach is. So again, it's a more systematic thing. It's typically a more statistical kind of approach to summarizing the research literature. So finally, let's think about what should a reader take away from a review paper. To a reader at the end of a review paper. Firstly, this should have some structure for understanding an area, for understanding the literature, perhaps in some areas, technology, the policy, or whatever in that area. And then they can use that structure to understand the papers that you've reviewed in that review paper, but also in the future to understand how their subsequent reading fits into the landscape of the subject. Where does it fit into that structure that you've given them? The reader should have an idea of the core ideas of a large number of papers in the subject. So they should come away from it with a feeling that they know what the most important papers are and broadly what those papers have contributed. So there's an idea of, you know, they should leave the paper where it's appropriate, and you know it might not be appropriate for every area, but where things can be compared somewhat objectively, there should be some understanding of which techniques are the state of the art in the area. So say you're doing some kind of survey of algorithms for a particular approach, or statistical techniques for a particular approach, or experimental methods for a particular topic. You should leave the paper with some idea of what is current. Yeah, this experimental method is typically recommended for this kind of problem. This experimental method seems to be the best for this. This experimental method is covered widely in the literature, but it's been superseded by this and this. You know, you should have some informed opinion of what the state of the art is, what's perhaps been superseded, what's out of date, people should leave with some idea of what they should use. That's not relevant to every area, but in many areas, what the opportunities are in the area, what gaps are there for future research, what open problems are there, what opportunities are there for future research in the area. And indeed, some review papers are driven primarily by that. They're driven by problems, open problems, and what leads up to them, rather than by topics in the subject. So let's finish. Let's summarize what we've said. So we talked about review and survey papers. So what do we mean by that? Well, we mean a structured, somewhat exhaustive, critical, analytical review of the research in a particular area, aimed primarily at people new to the field. And we've talked about related ideas, tutorial papers, which perhaps have a bit more detailed content about how to do particular things. There are reviews of research, systematic reviews and meta-analyses, and we've talked about those other concepts, those other kinds of papers and so on that are similar to but perhaps distinct from a traditional review or survey paper. What's the process? What's the process of preparing these? Well, it's primarily finding and reading those papers. Finding papers by searching for keywords, finding connections through that citation network, and looking at further work by specific authors and groups. I think an important thing to remember is that papers can be relevant to a topic in lots of different ways. They can provide techniques, ideas, open problems, applications, data sets, resources, and so on and so on. There isn't one way in which papers can be relevant to a topic. And finally, a review paper should aim to do four things. It should give an understanding of what the most important literature is in a topic. It should give a structure, the state of the art, what's current, and what's perhaps dated or superseded in an area, and finally outline the opportunities for future research in the area. So thank you very much. I will finish there, and I think there's a few minutes for questions and comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor. We are really thankful to you. You have explained the entire process of writing a systematic review paper very nicely. Thank you so much. Thank you. And we are open for some questions. With your permissions, can we take some questions from the audience?
Please do. Yes.
Okay. So I request you can, all participants, if you have any questions for Professor Colin, you may post your questions in the chat window. In the meantime, Professor, I have one question. Can I ask?
Yes.
Okay, so for writing a systematic review paper, definitely you need data. You need data that what all has been published till now. So I'm really interested in knowing any open source repository which is available from where we can get that data and we can work on new keywords and new search terms. Professor?
Yes, for data for papers, I think, I think increasingly, again, it's very dependent on the particular subject area, but I think we are starting to see increasingly data being made available. So, a lot of papers will have supplementary material now, which is the data sets that we used in that paper. Some universities are having data repositories, certainly at my university, and a couple of other collaborators, they will have, perhaps through the university library, researchers will deposit data that they had, they'd used in experiments or surveys or whatever. That they will deposit the original data, with the university library on their website. There are in some areas and I think this is good practice for journals, you know, they insist on data being provided along with the paper, you know, in some standardized formats. And I think being able to reanalyze data is really interesting, you know, being able to you know, and I think that's really moved some areas along a lot, is when there's been a standard format for data. So you know, there's
so as you have explained that there are two set of data sets. One is exploratory or experimental data. This will depend upon the type of research, type of field you're working on, right? Yeah. And there is another set of data which is of type publication.
Yeah, and I think with publications you have you know, you can there are obviously sometimes tables of data within papers, and people who are doing these kind of, you know, when you're doing these kind of meta-analyses of papers, people will often take the data from the papers. You know, there won't necessarily be a separate data set, but they will take tables of data, try and put them into common formats, and then analyze them. You know, sort of, I think it's a valuable thing to do if you're doing a research review, is to say, you know, here's a table, here are the possible things that we you know, might have been considered, and this paper reported this, and this. This paper reported this, and this. They won't all report. They won't all report the same thing. Not every paper will report the same data, but by putting in a table, you can say this is contained here, this is contained here. Right. This paper covered this, but there are gaps in what that paper covered. Yes. And, you know, and that helps people to understand. That's a really valuable thing to include in those things. Yeah.
Very well said. Very well said.
Okay, I think there are one or two people who've got their hands up now. Yeah.
You can post, all participants, please post your queries in the chat window. It is now enabled. You will share the feedback link of the first session. We are here open for the question answer round with Professor Colin Johnson.
Message.
So, Professor, one more thing, we can have the data, like published data set for a particular research. We can get it from the Web of Science, right?
Yeah, I think, I mean, researchers, you know, some research groups are very good at that. You know, I think, you know, some research groups are very good at publishing and making their data available. Some are less so. You know, it's not unreasonable to approach researchers and say, you know, you published this paper. You know, could I have a copy of the data set?
Yes,
you know,
exactly. As you have mentioned, because for a particular area, if we do not have the data of what all has been published till now, it is very difficult. The way you read paper, it is very unstructured. It should be a structured way from where it started and from where it is going. It is very important to see that, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think learning how to read papers, particularly at the beginning, is, you know, and papers have a certain structure.
The beginning is very important.
You know, I think when you're starting out as a researcher, you know, I think learning how to read papers is challenging, you know, and you need to I think you should read papers purposefully. You know, you don't read them, and you don't need to read all of a paper. Yeah, you may have a particular question in mind. You're saying, I want to read this paper because it's relevant to my research in this way. So you might read one paper to understand what the open questions are in a particular area. You might read another paper to understand a particular technique. You might read another paper to understand about a particular source of data or something like that. But you might not care about some parts of a paper for your particular purpose. You know, there might be, you know, in the area in which I work, in computer science, in machine learning and so on, there's often a large theoretical section of a paper followed by a large experimental, you know, a practical section. And so if you're interested in the theory of the subject, you might read the theoretical side in a lot of detail and then just skip through the experimental side. If you're interested in the experiments and replicating those experiments, you might skip through the theory part and concentrate on the experiments, yeah? So don't necessarily feel that you have to read everything in full detail, and also try and get used to reading a paper quickly to get the core ideas. You know, I think don't be afraid to read things more than once, yeah? If we read a story or a novel, we read it once, yeah? But with a scientific paper, we read it multiple times, and we think of different questions. An academic paper, we think of questions and we reread the paper with those questions in mind.
Very well said and very well explained, Professor. You have given us so much of input. I just cannot thank you much. You have given so much of input to us that how to actually write and go for a systematic review, literature review, rather than going for an approach of an like unstructured way of writing a review paper. It is very, very important. Also, you have explained how to go for a meta-analysis and what fields a meta-analysis is going to work. Thank you so much. We are receiving a very good review.
I can see some comments in the chat. It's very nice to see some.
Our participants are really very, they are thankful to you for your informative session and definitely for your time, your precious time that you have devoted with us. Thank you so much for connecting with us.
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me
to
talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, sir.
Bye-bye.
Okay, so all participants, you all are requested to please give your feedback and please provide your feedbacks in the link shared. And we have our next session from 2:30 p.m. onwards, 2:30 to 3:30, and you are all requested to join by 2:25. Thank you so much for connecting with us. We'll be having our next session on organizing and structuring high impact factor journals by Jacinthi Mendes, and it will start by 2:30. Thank you all. You have been a lovely audience. Thank you so much. I'll be sharing the links in this chat window. Please wait for a while. I will be sharing it here. Thank you so much. Thank you.